Good. I'm going to talk about weather first. Sorry about the slide being a little not as clear as it could be. But weather is the great equalizer. As Jeremy said about Australia, you can have all the supplies you want, but weather can even the score in 1 year's time, and we've seen it happen over and over again. And so we think we're heading into a really, really challenging 3-year period coming up. The first one being the one we're in now, especially for Asia. This is a chart since 1870 of the Indian monsoon season. And what I'm trying to make here is that every single monsoon that's been down 10% or more has occurred in an El Nino year. So we're in an El Nino year. We're expected to be in one through the entire year. And that means that India is on the table for a significant weather event. It may not be enough to change the bearish vernacular, but maybe it is. Certainly, though, if weather becomes an issue in India, you can bet the rice price will rise, at least for a little while, on concern about how bad it may or may not be. That's part of the speculative nature of commodities. And so we're pretty excited about the possibility of getting at least some excitement for a little while in the Asian rice price based upon what could be probably one of the more challenging weather scenarios we've seen in Asia, really since 2015, the last time we had an El Nino. So this is a very interesting chart. And other Asian countries, by the way, have similar trends. This is the Indian Ocean Dipole. The other thing that really impacts India is the sea surface temperature between the west coast and the east coast. Typically, a positive reading means more rain. A negative reading means less rain. And so when you have an El Nino, which means usually dry, and you have the Indian Ocean Dipole either negative to neutral, like it looks like it will be at least through a good part of the summer, you have even a greater propensity for a drier monsoon season in India than you would otherwise be the case. And so if this forecast for the Indian Ocean Dipole plays out, it would say that India is once again going to be on the table for a weather scare in the least, and possibly, a very poor crop depending on how things play out. We went back and said, what was the last time we had an El Nino and an Indian Ocean Dipole that was flat to negative over the summer like we have now? And that was 2002. And this is a chart of the rainfall as percentage of normal. You can see India. You can see northern China. You can see Indonesia. Lots and lots of dry, lots and lots of bad weather. And of course, that year, the Indian production, I believe, was down about 20%. It was actually the worst rice crop they have had since was during 2002. So I'm not sitting here saying that we're going to have a 20% knockdown in Indian rice production, but it's possible. At least the setup is there for something very, very serious to happen in India, not to mention other Asian countries. And so we still feel that despite it all, the speculators, the investment monies that Jeremy was talking about could flood our market at least for a little while and provide an exciting move that producers may be able to sell into at a level that makes more sense from a business perspective. This is the United States. I want to kind of flip back to the United States because we're looking at the wettest, most saturated soils in 125 years, meaning this chart is a soil saturation ranking. So when it says 99 percentile in the dark green, that means this is the most saturated the soils have been ever. And so we went back and we have never, ever seen such a wide swath of the U.S. enter the spring planting season with soil moisture saturation levels in the 90 to 99 percentile like this. It's just unprecedented. So while most are used to it, and we're used to it as well, that the crop always gets planted, the equipment can get it done in 5 days, and we certainly do appreciate the magnificence of new equipment, we certainly are keeping an open mind that this year may be a different story. And the reason we think it could be a different story is because when you have saturated soils like this, and you get any kind of rainfall, there's nowhere for it to go but causing more flooding, running off into the rivers, and making planting even more problematic. when we look at what the rainfall potential here is going into the middle part of April, and some of the weather maps that go back into the end of April are showing a large swath of the Midwest with well above average rainfall at a time where flooding is already there and continuing with swelling rivers. We look at this and say to ourselves, there's probably a pretty good chance that the speculators, the investment community, is going to get excited by this and probably rush in and buy very depressed markets. Right now, we have some of the largest short positions in grain markets in a very long time. It would not take much to cause some very significant short covering rally in the grain markets and, get a move that many people are not expecting to see. So we would keep an open mind to this year when we have this kind of an anomaly. It's certainly something not to take lightly, and it's certainly something to keep your trigger on the beat of what's happening. And it may be a time to do some risk protection that you wouldn't normally do to the upside, given something like this, in case this is an Australian moment that something happens during planting season that normally does not. I want to talk about the sun. Jeremy alluded to it in the last part of his presentation and how important the sun is. This is an actual physical representation of the size of the sun and the planets of our solar system, and you can see the arrow pointing to the Earth. You can barely see the Earth compared to the sun. Many, many weathermen, climatologists, meteorologists think the sun has no impact on our weather or has very little. I beg to differ that this big ball of fiery heat and gas has no impact if it modulates or changes a little bit. In fact, history is riddled with lots of huge impacts that the sun can have on our weather. And we feel, as Jeremy alluded to, that we're entering into a period where the sun is going to start impacting our weather to a great degree. The Barycenter. This is something that Dr. Gleisman, a physicist, talked about many, many, many years ago. And what it has to do is that the planets are constantly rotating, constantly spinning, and the center of mass is constantly moving, and the sun actually rotates around the center of mass, which means it actually wobbles. It moves. It's not a continuous, steady rotation. This chart here is 2019 is the top arrow, and it shows where the Barycenter is now. The bottom circle is where it will be in 2037. So that we're going to completely change the center of mass of our solar system over the next 20 years. And that means that the sun is going to completely change its rotation that we see today. And the effect of that rotation is to actually move the sun further away from the Earth. Now, it doesn't have to be moved too far away. Just a little further away reduces the solar radiation hitting our Earth, and that has a dramatic shift in how our weather patterns are affected, how our wind patterns are affected. And so this is one factor that's a big change going on that we feel is going to be impacting the weather scenario and the weather volatility now and going forward at an accelerating degree. Jeremy kind of already showed some of this, but notice how the sunspot cycle, the peak of the sunspot cycle, is actually been going down and down and down for the last 20 to 30 years. This is a sun that's going quiet, and we're now entering a period where it's called the Grande solar cycle minimum, or an elongated period where the sunspots are at a lower level. Sunspots are needed to create the solar heat that keeps our planet in balance. Take that away, and everything changes. Dr. Gleisberg is called the Gleisberg cycle. It's an 88 to 90 year, 1 in 100 year drought cycle in the core grain belt of the United States. He found through his physical work that every 88 to 90 years, based upon the Barycenter, based upon the rotation of all these planets, that we get a period where the sun either expands or contracts and causes an unusual drought. One for the books for a whole century. 1845 was the one that was the 1 in 100 drought in the 1800s. We moved forward 88 to 90 years. It was 1935, which of course was the Dust Bowl era. And we move 88 to 90 years ahead, and it says that the next 1 in 100 year drought for the Midwest is going to occur between 2023, the chart should say, that was a typo, 2023 to 2025. This periodicity has been going on for thousands of years, repeatedly in a regular cycle. Will it happen again? I can't say for sure 100% that it will, but history says that it is likely to occur again, and we should be on the lookout for one of those rare instances where we get a drought of that magnitude, which would completely change the oversupply of the grain markets that we currently are suffering from and have been suffering from for quite some time. Anybody could do a search for the Gleisberg cycle. He talks all about it, but it's a fascinating set of studies that he did. Okay. Why does the sun go quiet? Really quick, the sun goes quiet because the magnetic fields that are constantly spinning in different modulation get caught on the opposite side of the sun and cancel each other out. If the magnetic field strength is too low, sunspots can't occur. Dr. Korkaza did a study over thousands of years of how these sun's magnetic fields oscillate. And you can measure this now, and this is a measure of how constructive they are. Strong negative and strong positive are very, very good sunspots, very good magnetic fields, lots of sunspots. But notice how we are shrinking and shrinking and shrinking until we get into the 2030s, and there's almost a complete magnetic field canceling out. That means that that's a period where there'll be almost zero sunspots. You'd have to go back to the Maunder minimum to the last time we had a period of absolutely zero sunspots. And this has been back tested by her studies going back thousands of years and has a regular periodicity to it. So this is something that we're entering into. And so Jeremy had asked the question, how bad it will be, how long will it last? The good news, it's not going to last as long as the Maunder. The bad news, if this study is correct, it will be for a little while, in fact, as bad. And this is a study this is part of her work that she also did showing the 220-year cycle of grand solar cycles. And it's based upon how these magnetic fields modulate around the sun. It can be measured, it can be calculated, and it's a mathematical physics equation that's followed. And you can tell where we are now when we're heading into this very short 30 to 40 year period of an extremely low solar cycle period that's going to throw weather volatility off the rails. I think this is absolutely fascinating when we look at the current solar cycle against the last grand solar cycle we had 220 years ago. Jeremy talked about it being the Dalton, and you can look at how closely we are following the solar cycle from 220 years ago. It's absolutely remarkable that we can put two charts on top of each other 220 years apart of the solar cycle, and they're almost mimicking each other. It shows you that there is something going on that's cyclical with the sun, that's measurable with the sun, and it's happening again. This is an indication that we're entering into an extended trough over the next 3 or 4 years that is not going to be kind for global weather patterns. When the sun goes quiet, cosmic rays bombarding the earth go up significantly. The reason is the sun's magnetic field goes down. It can't block these cosmic rays from hitting the earth. This is an absolute, we measure this every single day, and you can see we're almost making new record highs in cosmic rays hitting the atmosphere of the earth. And the reason why this is so important is because these highly charged protons hitting the earth create a meridional structure of our jet stream. The polar vortex that we've been hearing about this winter that caused some of the coldest temperatures in 125 years is because the jet stream has gone loopy, I call it. It's moving around the earth like a snake instead of a zonal flow, which keeps the weather patterns more normal. When you get this kind of a snaky upper weather wind pattern, big storms, stalled storms, violent temperature shifts, droughts, floods. It means dramatic increases in weather volatility. So the more that these cosmic rays increase, the more that the jet stream becomes loopy, the greater the extremity of the weather volatility that we're going to see. Jeremy alluded to volcanic eruptions. These particles have been shown in physical studies that they actually enter the center of the Earth, impact the mantle, and actually weaken the magnetic field of the Earth. As that happens, seismic activity around the Earth is allowed to come alive. What I love about this chart is there's something called the Volcanic Explosivity Index. It's a measure of how much particles have been blown up into the air, into the stratosphere. A VEI of 5 or higher is enough to actually impact the weather in terms of blocking the sun from coming in and increasing the weather volatility and actually cooling temperatures down pretty dramatically. Since 1610, there have been 8 of these kinds of eruptions, and 7 out of 8 have occurred during grand solar cycle minimums. It is highly likely we're going to see another one of these eruptions occur during this next period of the grand solar cycle minimum. The last one to go off was Mount Tambora in 1812. Anybody can do a search on the internet about the year without a summer. That's when we had no summer in the US, no summer in Europe. We actually had snow and frost in the Midwest in late June. Can you imagine having snow and frost in late June in the middle of the Corn Belt? It would be a crop failure. So this is something that if you hear on the news, or you hear Jeremy, or you hear me talking about a volcanic eruption that has achieved a VEI 5, 6, or higher, you'll have to know what that's going to mean to price, to weather, and to production. These are United Kingdom and EU prices of rice and wheat going back to the last grand solar cycle minimum. The point I was trying to make is that prices, where we are is where the arrows are, and due to the adverse weather that took place back then, prices went up 3 to 4-fold in the first wave, had a big correction, and then went up significantly again on the second wave. This is kind of what we're expecting to see here, that once this weather pattern kicks in and materially impacts production, we're going to see big spike trade, huge bull market, kind of a correction, a buy the rumor, sell the news kind of a correction, and then another wave as the grand solar cycle minimum continues to play out. So this is the kind of pricing we saw back at the last grand solar cycle minimum. Yields. Everyone thinks that this is the only time over the last 40, 50 years that we've seen yields growing like they have. That's not true. Yields grew like crazy in the 1600s before the Maunder minimum took place, and then we spent 100 years of going flat to down. The same thing, we had very, very strong increase in yields in the 1700s into the mid-1700s. We hit the Dalton minimum, and then yields went flat for about 50 to 60 years. And then, of course, yields have been growing again. It is our strong belief that as we enter this next period of 30 to 40 years, that the yield growth that we've been accustomed and expecting and relying on to keep our food well supplied and to keep 9 billion people that's expected to be on this planet well fed is not going to be achievable and is going to come up way, way short of the mark. And then we're going to have to figure out what do we do about it once that happens. Maybe, just maybe, the Chinese are stockpiling such large quantities of wheat and rice because they know more than anybody else what this means, and they want to be prepared that they do have a year's worth of supply of food on hand in case we get into this scenario where food becomes really, really scarce. Just an idea. They're pretty smart people. It is expensive. We think there could be a reason behind that. Some of the best solar work that we have come across comes from the Chinese. I want to talk about El Nino, La Nina. I'm sure many of you on the call have heard about this before. Know what it, we go through this oscillation quite often. It's the sea surface temperature differential in the Central Pacific Ocean. What I want to highlight here is that when we get to the trough periods of the solar cycle, like we are now, we lead in with an El Nino and we flip to a La Nina. It's a repeated cycle, happens over and over and over again, and it always creates very adverse weather for grain markets. The last time we were in a trough was 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012. That was our last trough where we had the El Nino to La Nina flip. And as everybody knows, weather went crazy. We had the drought in the U.S. We had the massive drought in Russia, 2010-11, and we had prices that went crazy, fourfold, threefold increases in prices during that period of time. And we are just now entering that same place that we were entered in 2009. If you recall, in 2009, we had the Great Recession, massive supplies, no hope, no prayer. We'll never see grain prices go up again. And 3 years later, we went from $3 corn to $8 corn. So we are absolutely playing this cycle out again, and it means everyone needs to be alert for significant changes in weather and needs to protect themselves in case history repeats itself yet again. This is just a timeline. It's actually a timeline I put together 2 years ago based upon this grand solar cycle analogs that we work with. And obviously, it's basically mimics what I just said. We're in an El Nino year in 2019. We're going to transition in 2020. And then the La Nina comes in 2021 into 2022. This is a measure of the number of billion-dollar weather disasters globally in constant dollar terms. In 1992, we had some of the lowest weather volatility that we had seen, and that was the year where the sun reached its peak solar irradiation. As I showed in one of the prior slides, solar irradiation has been falling ever since, and look at the increase in weather volatility disasters since then. Notice a spike where the circle is. That was the trough of the last solar cycle, and we had this big spike in 2009, 10, and 11, and now you can see we're starting to spike again as we're entering this trough. We would expect this chart to show record disasters on terms of billion-dollar disasters over the next 3 to 4 years as we increase the weather volatility. I'm a little less bearish about things than Jeremy is in terms of looking at overall supply. I look at the fact that we've had really good crops overall, and yet total grain inventories are actually fallen for 2 years in a row when you factor in everything. It's not fallen a lot. It's not fallen enough to make a difference to price, but it is on the decline, and we haven't really gotten any major weather, like anything really, really bad yet with weather. If we go into another big period of weather volatility like 2009, 10, and 11, these trends of falling grain stocks are going to accelerate. I have no idea how much China supply they actually have. It's a secret. We can all speculate. They keep changing the numbers. We forgot to count acres from 10 years ago. We added it here. We found supply there. Was it wrong 10 years ago? Is it right today? The reality is I don't have any idea. So all I know to do is let me look at the data that I think I have a reasonable idea of what those supplies are and what is it telling me. In the wheat market, ex-China, stocks to usage are actually pretty tight, meaning that if China decides it doesn't want to export any wheat anytime soon, and we get additional weather problems for wheat's going to start approaching what we did in 2012, 2011, 2013, when the wheat price went crazy. So to me, this is a warning call that if we get into weather problems and we get to some kind of a panic and the investment monies flow in, the yellow line are the people that are going to have supplies to sell. I'm not so sure the Chinese are going to be willing to give up their wheat stocks if they fear there's a global shortage on the way. Once again, this is corn. Ending stocks to usage ratio, ex-China. Look at the box that says 2018 and 19, and we're actually fairly tight. We're approaching some of the tightest levels since 2010 and 2011, despite very, very good U.S. crops. So the way I look at this, once again, is if we are already reducing our stocks to usage ratios ex-China, and we get in some increased weather volatility that we expect to see, we're going to get ourselves in a heap of trouble really, really fast. Soybeans, it's a problem. It's the one market I can't get myself around in terms of saying this is not a problem. It is a problem. The one thing that I will say is that China, as Jeremy pointed out, China does not have any. But it is a problem, is going to need time to work off. And a wet planting season, a delayed planting season means more soybean acres. This market is a problem for us. It's the truth. We have a problem with soybeans. Maybe the Chinese stockpile a bunch of soybeans because of a trade deal. It's certainly possible, but we do have a problem with the soybean market and have a hard time putting a bullish spin on this market. We would be very concerned about soybeans once any trade deal, euphoria may wear off a little bit. This is cotton, and we're really concerned about cotton. Cotton has been one of the few markets that's been high priced for the last several years. U.S. cotton farmers have actually been able to make good money on cotton, and because of that, everyone in the world is going to want to plant this coming season. And so long as the weather allows them to get it in the ground, we're thinking that crop potential is very, very high, and that demand. We're very concerned about the slowing global economy. Cotton demand is very economically sensitive, and when we see purchasing managers index across the globe crashing into recessionary territory, we really wonder how cotton demand is going to hold up at a time of increased production. So, the cotton market's rallying right now. It's rallying because we're worried about some planting problems, some planting delays. We have some tighter stocks that were developed from last year's poor crops, but we think there's a selling opportunity that's approaching here in cotton, and it's one of the markets we don't think very highly of into the summer and into the fall. Even if there's crop problems, we don't think that'll be enough to overcome slowing demand. We have to talk about African swine fever. It is the biggest story in agriculture right now. It's probably the biggest ag story in the last 40 years. The African swine fever has impacted the Chinese like never before. And this is a chart. This is their data, the Chinese data, which we know is probably underestimating the problem. We actually have information that says it could be way worse than this, but their own data says that their hog inventories are down 20% year over year. 20%. Let's put it this way. That's about 24.5 billion pounds of pork is not there now that was there a year ago. The entire export market of pork in the upcoming year is expected to be about 19.5 billion. What that means is the Chinese could buy the entire exportable supplies of the world and still not fill the gap for African swine fever. It's just an enormous problem, and it means it can't be done. They cannot buy the entire export market. It can't be done. So what it means is they're going to have to substitute chicken, poultry, beef, fish to fill this gap, to buy time for increased animal feeding units in 2020 beyond, to start increasing production and filling the gap. What this means is that grain feed demand in 2020 is going to go crazy to the upside based upon the African swine fever and the running up of prices of cattle. We've already seen the hog market go crazy to the upside, putting on 10, 15, 20 points depending on the contract in a matter of 3 to 4 weeks. Just amazing. So this is a very, very bullish demand side story for grains. And usually what happens is smart operators don't wait to 2020 to buy their feed. They'll stockpile it now in preparation for the extra animal feeding units they're going to need for 2020. We think this is a ongoing, progressively bullish demand story that's going to continue to play out as the year progresses. It is a huge story, and the meat proteins are going to be at the center stage of it. Currency. You cannot look at an ag market, a commodity market, and not try to figure in what is the currency likely going to do. Ever since we came off the gold standard in the early 1970s, the U.S. dollar has been on a very regular 8-year cycle from peak to trough, trough to peak, peak to trough, and it also follows what we call the political affiliation cycle. The dollar rises under Democratic presidents, it falls under Republican presidents. The cycle peaked actually in the late part of 2016 to early 2017, and that actually has been our peak in the US dollar. And so we expect the US dollar to accelerate to the downside as we move further into this cycle, and a weaker dollar improves US exports and improves the prices of US priced commodity markets. It is a huge factor. Sometimes it's actually a more important factor to price than fundamentals at times if the speculators get excited about inflation. Bitcoin, it went from obscurity to mainstream. Everybody now knows Bitcoin is around. They have an idea of what it is. Bottom line is it's this alternative monetary asset that competes for the US dollar for global capital. What the point we are trying to make with Bitcoin is it has tended to be a leading indicator to the US dollar. It starts going up inversely to the dollar before the dollar starts going down, and vice versa. Just in the last 3 days, Bitcoin is up 25%, breaking out on the chart, and a flight away from quality, meaning if money is going into Bitcoin, that means it's not comfortable going into the US dollar. It's suggesting that confidence in the US dollar is waning, and that that should be a forewarning and a precursor to a weakening US dollar. So we think that the breakout of Bitcoin is a significant, important event. Real quick, we measure capital flows very, very carefully with our algorithm that we created and back tested for 40 years. We don't know everything. We can't know everything, but we know collectively the insiders, the smartest money in these markets, know everything that there is to know, and how they're betting with their money we listen to, and they've been fantastic at creating buy signals at bottoms and sell signals at tops. And right now, they're starting to become much more bullish, the grain markets overall. You can see on the right-hand side, we've seen some buying. We had a little rally in grains a few weeks back, a little selling, but the crash in prices this past week, we expect this chart to go zooming back up into even stronger buy signal in the upcoming 1 to 2 weeks. This is telling us to expect a rally in grain prices. It doesn't say how big the grain rally will be. It doesn't say necessarily how long it will be, but it says that a credible, tradable, hedgeable rally is very likely between now, late spring, early summer. And we think this weather issue that we talked about in the spring, the extreme wetness, the challenging planting, and maybe some of the drought that may start popping up in Asia could be the reason why speculators start piling into this market and driving it up. But right now, the smartest people out there are betting for higher grain prices, not less. So want to quickly end my talk with this. If I'm right, if the history is right, if this grand solar cycle plays out the way we expect and we have significant challenges in growing food, what do we do about it? How do we have a pathway forward to get through this? Technology is always the grand equalizer. When we got in trouble with natural gas, fracking came along and found all this natural gas and reduced our problem. We think that indoor vertical farming, greenhouse farming, hydroponics farming, whatever you want to call it, is going to be a huge investment opportunity over the next 10, 20, 30 years. In fact, we think it could be one of the bubble markets of the stock market going forward when the food shortages kick in and everyone's trying to find out ways to get through it. Venture capital, the smartest people out there, have invested over $1.5 billion in this area over the last 2 years. And these guys don't make investments just by chance. They do their homework, they're smart, they make big money, and they're seeing an opportunity in vertical farming. I'm wondering if they are also onto this grand solar cycle idea of what's coming up with the weather, because it's been a dramatic change in capital flows in this sector, literally in just the last couple of years. This would be an area, if someone's on this call thinking about opportunities, we'd be looking at vertical farming as an investment opportunity going forward. 2021, 2022, why do I bring this up? It is going to be the La Nina year. The La Nina year at the solar cycle trough is when the United States gets its chance to have really, really bad weather. El Nino is when Asia can get its chance. El Nino is not typically when the U.S. gets its chance. But in La Nina at solar cycle troughs, it is when the U.S. is at center stage for having problems. The last La Nina at its trough, as I mentioned before, was 2010, 11, 12, and we know it was a disaster for the United States weather. I want to have everyone, if one remembers nothing from my talk today other than 2021 and 2022, put that on your screen, put it on your chalkboard, and keep it in mind, because that is the year that we feel that the grand solar cycle weather scenario is going to take center stage, and when everyone's going to wake up to what's really happening with weather and understand it's not a one-off thing, it's actually a multi-decade problem that we have to address. And it's also going to be when grain markets are going to go absolutely nuts. Because let's face it, outside of China, which we really don't know how much they have, and if they have it, how much they're willing to sell, the supplier of last resort is always the U.S. We always have the supply that everybody lets us keep until there's a problem. Then they come take it from the United States. So when we get into trouble, grain markets go crazy. And so I would certainly want everyone to realize that we're only a few years away from this, and we think it's going to be a significant event and really change the whole idea of what's the value of food, what should food be valued at in this new weather cycle, and how can we have a pathway forward to make sure 9 billion people that are coming have food to eat.
Thank you so very much.